Hey all, we're here for some updated 2018 predictions. This is what I see happening in 2018 in the interchangeable lens camera world, be it DSLRs, be it mirrorless interchangeable lens camera devices, and lenses as well. So first, I don't want to talk about that. Instead, what I want to talk about is Sony's newest lens that they've just released for APS-C E-mount cameras, which is really exciting. It's the 18 to 135 f3.5 to 5.6 OSS. This, as a few have already commented online, looks a ton like it's going to be Sony's newest kit lens option, not necessarily to replace the 16 to 50, but to provide an upsell for those wanting a little bit more range. And I think it's going to be a fantastic fit, coming in at just under a pound, and I think it's about 3/4 of a pound, with a really nice compact size with a good extendableness to it. I think that range is going to be really welcome on these really capable Sony devices. I hope that while the 16 to 50 at 16, where the corners just literally don't exist, they're not covered, I'm hoping that at 18 those corners are actually covered. I'm thinking that this is going to be a really great lens for a ton of people, just like the Canon and Nikon versions of it. First of all, for someone like myself, who is a bit of a prime whore, I think it's going to be great because, you know, if I can get the 3 or 4 primes that I want, and I can have those for the more serious stuff, then I can have a zoom that's this capable, 27, 28 to just over 200 mil equivalent range. So that's a huge range, nearly a 10x zoom for those of you who care about that kind of thing. I think that kind of range is going to be super useful for photographers like myself. I think it's going to be super useful for beginners. The big downside, of course, is 3.5 to 5.6. That's going to be a bummer, but most of the time when this kind of a lens is going to be used is going to be in bright conditions, right? Most newbie photographers aren't taking a bunch of indoor shots, they're going out specifically to use that device. So I think it's a really exciting piece of kit that I am so looking forward to getting some hands-on time with if I'm able to. And around 600 bucks, it seems to be priced really well, at least within Sony's lineup. And I think it's really important that we're seeing that Sony is paying attention to its APS-C users, as well as it's a great start for Sony. I don't think anybody has predicted up until this point that that type of lens would be released. I think we should have seen it as a little bit inevitable because it's a really common APS-C focal range. But now that we have seen it, I think it's a big indicator that Sony's going to be taking their APS-C division a little bit more seriously. So let's get into predictions for 2018. In terms of bodies, I don't know if I want to actually hit on lenses very much this review. We'll see. In terms of bodies, I think out of Canon, we gotta see a 7D Mark III, we gotta see a 90D. I think we're gonna see a mirrorless interchangeable lens camera as well. So that's full frame. So I think out of the 7D Mark III, I think 24 megapixels will probably happen. What I want to see is 28 or 30. I think we're gonna see a greater than 10 frames per second frame rate. I think we should see something like 12 or 14 with an electronic shutter. I think we'll see about 10 or 12 with a mechanical shutter. I think we're going to see the focusing system out of the 1DX Mark II. That only really seems to make sense in my view. I think we're also going to see either another CFast card slot or like an XQD. I think it would be really exciting if we could see like an XQD card slot on one of those things. That'd be really nifty. We gotta see 4K on it, and we gotta see a tilty flippy touchscreen, in my opinion. So, and DPAF, of course, right? So 4K, I think probably shouldn't have a crop on it. I think it's gonna be full width, but I'm expecting that Canon will disappoint with that and that there will be some sort of a crop. I am also expecting that there will be a not fantastic codec to work with in 4K. So I'm really hoping that what we see is something 100, 150 megabits a second in 4K. If we're going to see something lower end than motion JPEG, what I'm expecting is that we'll see something closer to 50 or 75 instead of 100 or 150, just to help differentiate between Canon's cinema models. They shouldn't do that, but they probably will. Out of the 90D, that's, you know, the successor to the 80D, I think we'll probably see another 24 megapixel sensor. That's just what Canon's making right now. I think we're gonna see the same processor. I think we're gonna see mostly everything be just about the same. I think it will have a better focusing system. I think they will put a little bit of time into that. I think they've kind of expanded the utility and gone to the limits of the utility of the 80D focusing system that we've seen iterated on with the other cameras that are using the exact same sensor and processor, including, although not the sensor, the 6D Mark II. I'm hoping that we see a slightly better one in the 90D. We got to see 4K. If the 7D Mark III has no crop in 4K, on the 90D we should expect to see a crop in 4K, and vice versa, in my opinion. I think a slightly better, more robust codec is more likely on the 90D than the 7D Mark III, just because the 90D, you know, the XXD series of cameras has historically tended to be more video focused. I think that we'll have to expect a price when it comes out between $1,300 and $1,700, probably closer up on that higher end. I don't have a very strong idea of what to call the hopefully incoming Canon mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. I think since the M5 is an APS-C sensor that's an equivalent of an 80D, I think perhaps an M4 would be, you know, something like a 7D equivalent. I think in an M3, what we'd see is a 6D equivalent, in an M2, a 5D equivalent, and in a M1, we'd see a 1DX equivalent. So if we're going to stick with that naming convention, right? So if it's going to be named M and then one number, I think it's going to be an M2, because I think it's probably going to be a 5D Mark IV port, if you will. I think we're going to see the same sensor. I think we're going to see a very similar focusing system. In terms of the DPAF, I think it will be a DPAF heavy camera. I think it's going to come in kind of at, you know, I think it's going to come in right below the 5D Mark IV in terms of price, right? So I think it's going to be about $3,000, between $2,800 and $3,100. It's got to have an EVF, right? I think it's going to be styled much the same way the M5 is. I think it's going to be 30 megapixels, you know, 5D Mark IV port, and I think we gotta see full width 4K. I think the reason why we wouldn't is to put it on par with the 5D Mark IV, so that you don't buy this instead of the 5D Mark IV. However, since I don't think that it will be EF native mount, I think we will see it being able to be a little bit quote-unquote better with that full width 4K and not motion JPEG. So I think that what we'll see instead is, you can buy an adapter or you can buy into EOS M full frame lenses, and I think Canon's going to make up the difference that way. In the last couple months, we've heard a ton about the potential for replacement for the 5DS, 5DSR. I think if we see that, we got to see a substantial megapixel bump. When the 50 megapixel 5DS, 5DSR came out, I'm just going to keep referring to it, by the way, from now on out as 5DSR, meaning both of them. It's just too much to do both. I think we should, when that came out, when the original one came out, it was, you know, a big deal. It was the first sensor on a full frame, it was the first full frame sensor that had that many megapixels, right? At the time, if I remember correctly, the most megapixels in a sensor was something like at a Nikon with 36. So I think we can expect 65 plus. I think 75 is a little bit unreasonable, but I think at least 60 is what we should be expecting. It's got to have the 5D Mark IV body, right? Because it's equivalent body design between itself and the current 5D series, and because of all those megapixels, it's probably going to have a slow frame rate, probably about 5, really. And in terms of video, I have no idea. I don't think it's a video-centric camera. I don't think it matters. I think it will have some ISO performance issues like we saw in the original 5DSR, so we'll see about that. Moving on to Nikon. With all the recall issues on the D750, I think it's reasonable to assume that there will be something of a replacement for the D600 series, D700 series cameras coming out around $2,000, kind of to match the 6D Mark II in terms of price while providing more value. I think what that will include is 24 to 28 megapixel sensor, probably just a 24 megapixel sensor. If Nikon's going to continue to work with the Israeli company that made the BSI sensor for the D850, I think it might be possible to see a BSI sensor on that device. If they're working with Sony, I think it's also possible, although less likely, because I think Sony's going to put a BSI sensor into the A7 III, which would be dope. And then I think it will have 4K. I think it'll have better 4K. I'm hoping for on-sensor phase detect autofocus points. I'm not hoping too hard. If they're there, probably going to be in a tight grouping. And yeah, I think that's mostly it for that. In terms of Nikon's foray into full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, I think we're not going to see the same strategy as Canon. I think Canon has put next to no effort into development into their cameras for quite a while. And so what we're going to be seeing instead, so for example, the 60 Mark II saw next to no product development time or energy put into it, as you can tell by the finished product, right? So it makes sense that the M2, if we're going to call it that, is going to be a much more thoughtfully developed camera, because all the time and energy went into that. Out of Nikon, we just saw a D850, which is a very thoughtfully, very intentionally designed camera that probably took a ton of resources and a ton of time to put together in the perfect package that it's ended up being. So out of Nikon, in terms of mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, I think we can expect a more entry-level option, a more first step into full frame kind of option. I think we can expect to see that around $2,000. I think we can expect it to require an adapter if you want to use your f-mount glass. I think we'll see 4K. I think we'll see 24 megapixels. That's a really common megapixel count nowadays, for better or for worse. So yeah, I don't think it'll be a too much of a complicated camera. I think it will have its own mount natively, because we've seen so many awesome patents out of Nikon for lenses. In terms of Sony, I think their entry-level options, the 5100 and the 6000, are heavily dated. I think that we need to see a replacement for an entry-level APS-C option out of Sony this year. I think we're seeing more attention being paid to APS-C because of concerns raised over the last year and a half, 2 years or so. I think we're going to see a replacement for that entry-level Sony. I think it's going to have 24 megapixels. I think it's not going to have stabilization. It will have 4K, and it will have the focusing system out of the 63-6500. And I think it will also have either the processor from the A9 or the color science from the A9, but no EVF, and I'm expecting that flip up screen, potentially touch, instead of just the tilty one or one that flips out. Although I would love to see one that flips out. In terms of the A7 III, looking at the A7 and the A7 II, I think with the pricing structure on those, we can expect the A7 III to come in around $2,000. I think it would be a shame if they kept it at 5 frames per second, 24 megapixels, so I'm hoping they bump that to 7 or 8 frames per second and 28 or 30 megapixels. I think it's time we moved past 24 megapixels as a baseline. I think we're going to see the same body from the A7R3/A9, depending on how similar you believe those bodies to be. Definitely the same battery. I think we won't see an AF joystick, however. I think the focusing system on the A7 III will be on par with the A7R3, because the A7 series of cameras was the first out of Sony's full-frame A7 series camera line to have phase detect autofocusing. So I think that that will be on par with the A7R3. Obviously, I think 4K is mandatory. I think I know there will be S-Log options, because there are already, but I think we should also expect to see some sort of HDR mode, maybe like an HLG or something like that, just to kind of push everything that direction. I don't think we'll see 60p 4K. I think we'll just see 30p, and I think we should expect a very low crop 1080 that's a bit higher quality at 120 frames per second or so. In terms of the A7S III, they can either be competitive with Panasonic and keep the price under $2,500, or they can stick with their historical pricing strategy and make that pretty much about $3,000, just over $3,000. I think they're going to go with the latter on that. I think when that comes out, it'll be $2,800 to $3,200. I think we have to see 4K 60p. I think we will see an HDR mode. I think we will see, more megapixels. I think we're going to see 16 to 18 megapixels, hopefully, so we can have a little bit more super sampling, make it an even higher quality 4K. We got to see the same body design as the A7R III with that bigger battery especially. And I think we're also going to be mandated almost to see phase-stacked autofocusing. I don't think it's going to be anywhere near something like an A7R III or an A9, but I think it will be on par at the very least with, the A7R II, that kind of thing. That's most of what I've been thinking about so far. I'm really glad that you've spent your time with me in this video. Please don't hesitate to check out the affiliate links in the description below. It would mean a lot to me if you would. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention in this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.